Hello everyone, am I audible? I hope I am audible, everyone. Audible. Okay, great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Product Notes session by M2P. We have curated these discussions for fintech enthusiasts to dive deep and talk to experts about financial products and technologies, thereby adding value to the community. I am Chinar, marketing manager at M2P, and today's Product Notes session is on Access Control Server, commonly known as ACS. We are glad to host this talk about the importance, evolution, and functionalities of ACS. To give you a brief, digital transaction and card based payments stand at 47% in the MENA region and are growing exponentially. With this uptake, payment frauds are also on the rise. According to Statista, fraud connected to e commerce and transactions could rise by more than $38.5 billion globally in the next 5 years. So, by improving the authentication process, card users can tackle payment frauds. I would like to introduce Mr. Madhusudhan Ramakrishnan, AVP Products, and Mr. Anish Kumar, AVP Business Development at M2P Fintech, to shed more light on how these financial institutes and fintechs can leverage the power of ACS. Hi, Anish.
Hello, Chinar. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Hi, Madhu. Madhu, your mic and video is off.
Sorry. Is it visible now? Is everything okay?
Yes, yes. How are you?
Hey, Chinar, doing good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So we'll start with the session. I'll put my first question to Mr. Madhu. So, Madhu, how important do you think is transaction security in today's world?
I think more than ever, actually, if you think about it, the very fact that we've all sort of pretty much shifted to a digital mode for transactions, right? I mean, and the pandemic has pretty much accelerated that. If you think about the last couple of years, I believe there's been a very, very strong shift from offline, obviously, because most of them could not transact much offline. They've all moved to online transactions. And I think we are at the cusp of, probably a point where everything is going to remain this way for a long time, right? So I think more than ever, the confidence factor needs to be there. Only if people are feeling much better about it, feel secure about their transactions, will they continue to engage in these. If they start seeing a few fraudulent transactions, they'll be very, very worried about the overall experience, right?
Right, right.
So that's, it's a very obvious requirement. And at the same time, customers need to be presented with a way that doesn't really inconvenience them as well, right? You've got to present a way which ensures the security, but at the same time, guarantees them a seamless experience as well. So I think we're at that stage where we'll have to work on something like that.
Sure. Anish, what are your views on transaction security?
To add to what this Madhu said, I think transaction security in this time and age is of paramount importance. The primary reason being this, as you know, this market is moving more and more away from cash and more into cards and digital. So everywhere we go, we see people using their cards to tap and pay, and there are different modes of transaction that they prefer.
Sure.
I mean, not just cash. What I mean to say is not just cash. There are different digital modes that is being more preferred now. So with the growth of e-commerce, there is a direct line you can draw where transaction security comes into the picture as well. Fraudulent transactions are increasing as well, and it is of extreme importance that we try and you know do what we can in order to make sure that these transactions are secure.
Sure. Even, I was also going through some stats. So I think shopping is one of the major contributor of digital payments in the MENA
Absolutely.
market specifically, right? So definitely, I think that it is important to have secure transactions. Okay. Now we know that transaction in terms of security in terms of transaction is very important. What are the various methods by which a consumer, a bank can ensure that the transaction is secure? Madhu?
Yeah, I think, if you think about it, ultimately a customer believes, right? If you think about it, we don't really think so much about how this is being done. We, at the end of the day, we hope that things are being done correctly by the bank, right? All customers pretty much place some sort of trust in their, issuing bank and believe things are being taken care of, right? You sort of believe that they're doing the right level of risk analysis. They know what's going on, and they're ensuring that you're the other person transacting, and they're going to keep you safe. That's the hope we all go with, right? And banks can do it in different ways. Of course, banks usually, what banks tend to do is, there is a fairly strong risk system in place for most of the top banks. They do have some sort of systems out there to completely analyze all the transactions, decide what they need to do. This is there for most of the top banks, right?
Right.
But in terms of being able to ensure that they can typically present some form of a challenge to a customer, right? To ascertain the identity of a customer, to validate that. Typically, banks try to use, especially in the cards domain, right? It could be different in different sort of form factors like wallets and some of the other ones. But in the cards domain, they rely on what is called the access control server, the ACS.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, banks try to work with a provider. They don't really try and build the ACS on their own, but what they do is they work with a provider who has set up an ACS system. They outsource this particular card not present security to an ACS provider. And within the ACS is set up as per the network guidelines, to card network guidelines. And that is really used to complete this whole identity verification. The two distinct legs where the identity verification happens in what is called the authentication leg. And ultimately, the final decision is to process the payment less in what is called the authorization leg, right? So that's really done by the bank. Finally, you got to check whether the customer has enough money to do it. Is the card actually valid or not, and so on, right?
Right.
But to know if it is indeed the same customer, is it Madhu doing it? Is it Anish doing it? Or is it somebody impersonating the customer, and so on, right? So that's really done in the authentication leg, and that's usually taken care of by an ACS provider. That's
Okay.
really been the approach, especially for all the card-based transactions.
Right. Right. Anish?
So, Madhu pretty much nailed the point we were trying to make here. Access control server is perhaps one of the most key elements, the ACS, in terms of having a transaction uh, done in a very secure manner. There are many ways to do it. A transaction has multiple legs. There is the authentication leg, there is the authorization leg. You could identify a potentially fraudulent transaction at any of these legs.
Okay.
But
Okay.
perhaps the simplest and the most effective way to do would be to try and identify if the customer's identity
Mm-hmm.
is intact. Madhu mentioned it beautifully when he said identity verification needs to be done by verifying if the customer is who he claims he is. There are two ways to do that. The two-factor authentication involves entering details, what you have and what you know. So that's the second factor authentication that we've been dealing with as I mean as an with ACS as a product.
Sure.
And there are fairly major players involved in offering this ACS as a service to different banks, institutions. There are card networks involved here as well when it comes to certification.
Okay.
And that being said, over the last 15, 20 years, access control server or the overall 3D secure compliance has grown into a much bigger unit in terms of ensuring this overall transaction security.
Security. Okay. Okay. Sure. So ACS, okay, I understand, I get it that it is very essential for security in terms of transaction. What
Mhm.
apart from ACS, or how transaction security has been evolving? I would like to know about that as well.
Yep.
You can.
It's a good question, Chinar.
It's a very good question.
I mean, see, we've all sort of evolved over the last many years in terms of payment options. As you can imagine, we started off broadly with cash, and then we've moved to the realm of cards, and then now there's numerous factors, right? You've got wallets, you've got UPI, and so on. In different countries, you've got different options, right?
Right.
Similarly, the security element as well as been more and more advanced over the years. We started off with probably the very lowly passwords, right? We started with that in the first few years, especially. And in fact, even until recently, I mean, probably being used even now in some of the markets, right? The password is still being used as a way to authenticate. It's perhaps one of the weaker forms because it can be cracked, and typically people end up using a standard type of password, and people are able to second guess that.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
but we moved from there into the whole one-time passports, the OTPs, right? Typically, with the use of mobile phones, they started using the OTPs as one way of doing it. Again, the OTPs started having some of these challenges as well over the last few years. You started having, first of all, SMS-based OTPs. There used to be delivery challenges. There used to be cost challenges associated with those in some markets, right? Then we started moving into more advanced ones, right? We've started getting smartphones now. We moved away from feature phones to smartphones. Now, why not use some of the features available in a smartphone? I mean, can I use an app-based notification? Can I use a soft token or an OTP generated inside an app to do it? Can I use the fingerprint or the biometric available to do it, right?
Right.
And plus, there are numerous other ways which they use what is called behavioral biometrics. Now, these are more advanced ways of authenticating a customer. These happen behind the scenes. Technically,
Of
it's
course.
all about trying to build patterns using a customer's transaction behavior on a particular website or on a merchant, right? You use that to decide if it was a different customer or if it's a different one, right? So a lot of advanced approaches have come in, and in fact, the card networks have also recommended that we go ahead with more advanced ones and move away from OTP. So, but yes, the OTPs are here to stay for a while. They won't just go away.
Sure. Anish, do you want to share something more on this topic?
Yes. So Madhu described a couple of form factors how we can authenticate transactions. Uh, the reason why we have had to go through that journey is because the more and more sophisticated the technology uh, gets when it comes to how we make the transaction security transactions more secure, frauds get more sophisticated as well. So it has come to a point where we have to try and add more layers to it in order to make not only the user experience better, but also to enhance or rather to ensure that the person who is doing the transaction is actually who he claims he is. If you if you remember, Madhu also mentioned about how OTPs and passwords are no longer sustainable as a mode of authentication. So we have had to rely on your behavioral biometrics. You'll have to rely on your device biometrics, for example, your fingerprint. There are different ways where you can authenticate, say, for example, your voice, your iris scan, your facial recognition, all of that. So the more and more layers you add to it, you can try and offer improved experience. Not only that, but also at the same time make it more secure in a way. Yes. So at this point, I see a question here. Madhu, the question, I think it's for you. In the entire ACS flow, have you thought of authenticating with new age tech like behavioral biometrics?
Right.
This helps in preventing human as well as non-human impersonations. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's really one of the factors that I was referring to, one of the more recent advancements. And simply put, there are given the current types of authentication options, like I mentioned, the OTPs and passwords. These are really ones that fraudsters are able to crack. For example, they get control of a user's device sometimes, or gullible users tend to even give away their OTPs or passwords sometimes, and these
Correct.
sort of things happen. So one of the major types of fraud, like the wishing frauds and stuff like that, these tend to happen, right? So behavioral AI is really something that is very, very difficult for a fraudster to impersonate, right? Like, for example, just like your fingerprint is almost like an inherence factor, it's very unique to
It's
you.
unique to you.
Yeah.
Correct.
Similarly, the way you interact, the way you type, the way you move the mouse, the way you specifically engage on a particular screen or a page is fairly unique. That pattern is something that is extremely sort of very intrinsic. A user I can't do exactly what Anish would do. For example, there would be differences that could be captured, and that is what behavioral AI works on. Right now, that's but the merits are obviously there. It's a question of how are you going to position it in the product in order to maximize its benefits. Right now, typically for for that particular, behavioral AI to work, it needs to have enough user interaction on your page, right? As long as you've built sufficient interaction, you can build a profile of a user. So there could be different ways of doing it. One, I would imagine, is as and when a customer continues to engage on the authentication page and types his OTPs, right? As he keeps typing his OTPs, you build a pattern using that, right? Every time I type the OTP or enter the OTP on a screen, right, on my mobile phone, I'm typing specific keys, and I continue to build a particular typing pattern, and you could use that, right? So going forward, in the event that a fraudster were to get hold of the phone, or even if if I have become a gullible guy and I'm actually given away my OTP to someone else, and if a fraudster is trying to enter the OTP, right, now at this point, what you can actually do is see his typing pattern, right, and immediately identify that, hey, this typing pattern. So just to give you a case in point, if it has been proved that if someone is actually listening to an OTP and typing it, right, vis-a-vis just reading it and typing it, there is a strong difference in the pattern, the way you type, right? If I'm hearing it over a phone and typing it, I'm going to do it differently. So a fraudster might probably get it from a gullible customer and is starting to type it, but you could identify the difference in pattern, and this could help you flag it right there, and then you could introduce a different form of challenge, like a secret question which only the customer might know and the fraudster may not know, right? So that's one way of you trying to use behavioral AI on the ACS page, typically using that to build a pattern. And for specific frauds such as these, or if there's a bot that has seized control of a phone and is quickly typing the OTP in there from that, for example, right? Now you can identify that it's indeed a bot because the typing pattern, the way the characters are entered, are very different from that of a customer. So that's one way of doing it. More advanced way, which obviously relies on what happens on the merchant front. If you're able to capture enough data on the merchant front, on the merchant app, like an Amazon, for example, where a customer is actually transacting, and send me this information ahead of time, I could use this information to decide early on, and I may not even require to challenge a customer. I may decide that, hey, it is actually a genuine customer. I don't even need to introduce a challenge, right? So we're still in early days yet, but these are some of the ways I believe you could figure it out.
Well, behavioral biometrics does have a long way to go when it comes to, acceptance more from the issuer side and the acquiring side. That being said, yes, there is a lot of progress on that front when it comes to identifying human behavior, identifying patterns, and there is a lot of AI in play as we speak. I hope that answers your question, Saurabh.
We also have a next question by Mr. Madhu Srinivas. How different is M2P from other players in fighting frauds? What's the USP here?
Okay. Yeah. So again, so when it comes to the ACS system, right? I mean, this actually helps me go into a specific, design of the system itself, right? The ACS by itself has two distinct components. If you look at it, the protocol part, which is strictly standardized, right? You have certain standards. You go according to what the card networks have set up, which used to be the 3ds 1.0, which was the older version of the protocol, which was designed. It's almost become a legacy system, which started off in the early 2000s, and then now we have moved into the 3ds2, which is called the EMV 3ds, right? But that's really the ACS, which is a standard system. There's not too much you can play around with the flow of the transaction out there, except when it comes to the mode of authentication. You could introduce different modes of authentication. Like I said, you could support different authentication options such as OTP, out of band, IVR, behavioral if possible, or biometrics itself, and so on, right? So that's a bit of flexibility that you bring into the mode of authentication, right? Of course, the way M2P system is designed is we have a very strong set of business logic and rules written in the ACS. So you can configure these sort of experiences for different types of customers. You could introduce a standard authentication experience for most of your customers. Maybe for some of the more priority or the premium ones, you could introduce something slightly different. You could ensure that for transactions less than say 50 USD or INR 2000, you don't really introduce an OTP or a challenge. But for all others, you can. There's a lot of personalized authentication experience that you can design on the ACS. So that's from a system design on the ACS, that's possible. From a risk perspective, that's really where there is a differentiation possible, right? Because the way you design your risk system, right? That's really a scenario where M2P comes in with a wealth of experience. Again, typically we've, most of us specifically working on the product or having spent the last few years in, working on the ACS and the risk part. The design of the rules, the way we accommodate different types of rules, the way we have designed the risk system, not just to use the transaction data, which is obviously going to come in a transaction message, but how else can we leverage additional forms of data, right? Can I use data from the issuer? Can I use additional data from a merchant? Can I connect to external sources of data? Can I get more information about customers, about their profiling, their chargeback history, their onboarding, and so on, right? How really can I combine different sources of data? Can I validate all these and put them together? That I think is the real crucial element what M2P is going to differentiate itself. We're not trying to provide a standard solution saying, hey, these are the only 10 rules that I have, you got to play with these, right? No, I'm trying to bring in a system here where I can blend different sources of data, put them all together to achieve the best possible result. So I think that in a nutshell is the key differentiator of M2P system.
I hope it answers Mr. Madhu's question. Coming back and circling to ACS, I think we have established what ACS is. I would like to, dive deep into what and why it is important for banks, to offer authentication for their customers.
Yep. I mean, we sort of hinted at this a little earlier as well, right? Like, imagine I'm a bank who's obviously offered my debit and credit cards to customers, and customers have started transacting online, right? Now, imagine a fraudster has gotten control of or got my card details, and he's used that to complete a transaction on a large merchant, and suddenly I get a bill saying that I have to pay 10,000 USD or something, whatever, right? And then a customer is obviously going to realize that he never did this transaction in the first place, and he's going to raise this back. And typically, customers are going to be protected. The liability would shift to the issuer in these scenarios. A issuer would probably have to raise this, because there's a chargeback request, it might come back to the merchant. I mean, the whole ecosystem, right? Different rules in different countries. Sometimes the merchants have to end up taking this, but especially in countries where there's a 3DS requirement or some of these 2FA requirements in place, and if you don't do it, ultimately, right, if you decide not to proceed with it, the liability will end up shifting, and obviously the issuer has to bear that at the end of the day. Not just the fact that you pay that amount back, or there's a reputation loss. There's nowadays with the whole social media scenario, imagine 5 or 6 customers just mention something like this. I'm sure that customers start moving away from your cards and typically shift to maybe competition or stop using it in your business suffers as well, right? So
Right.
overall, it's really about reputation. It's about your standing in the market. It's about customer confidence in online transactions that could affect the overall ecosystem itself, right? I mean, that really is a reason why you would set up a secure transaction experience. And I mean, like I said, you want to balance customer convenience with security, right? You don't want to challenge each customer and start sending OTPs to everybody, because that's also not something that they might be used to. I mean, again, like in market like India, we've been so used to that for the last 10 plus years, and if they don't send an OTP, you're probably going to get a little flustered. But
Right.
there could be a very different market which has never done this and suddenly starts doing it. So you should never really introduce something like this and go full on and introduce some drastic
Definitely.
things. The key is to balance it out, figure out only scenarios where you need to present a challenge, and present the customers with a challenge that they're most comfortable using, right? So especially understand there's a lot to figure out: what the market prefers, what are the costs associated, what are the success rates associated with such a mode, right? There's a lot that goes into designing this, right? So that's really where the nuances come in, actually.
Sure. So, Anish, now for markets like India, where it is, a mandate to, do the authentication before the transaction is successful for a consumer, it is like, as Madhu mentioned, it is important. It's like in our blood now that we have to get that OTP to get the transaction successful. But for markets like UAE, like in MENA, many of them it is not mandatory to have ACS.
Correct. You're right.
Yeah, it is. But for markets like MENA and even I think USA also, it's not mandatory to have ACS as as a compliance which should be a part of the banking system. So
Correct.
what do you feel that why banks are not getting onboarded, and why do you think, and how can banks benefit with products like ACS?
There are multiple angles. Let's try and dissect it a bit here.
Sure.
So when there is compliance involved, there is the banks definitely have to go with the ACS, regardless of uh, it's not a matter of how or if, it's a matter of when. So that's exactly let me draw example from what happened in India back in 2009. Uh, the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, made it mandatory in India, and we can draw a straight line between how banks made ACS mandatory for the systems for the cards that they issue and the growth of e-commerce. In this market, this is an emerging market for the entire e-commerce space. For example, let's take all these Middle East countries: Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar. These are markets where e-commerce is on the rise. Uh, there is a new generation of young people waiting to spend. There's a new generation of people who have access to cards. People who have just come into this entire scheme of banking, just waiting to spend, and they are ready to explore more than what traditional retail space has to offer. They want to try and explore the e-commerce space. So what it means is that banks have to try and make the system more robust.
Right.
How do they make their system more robust? By offering more security on their overall e-commerce experience. But that shouldn't come at the cost of disturbing the balance that the current customer currently has. If it means that the customer has to go through 4 different pages to authenticate himself, he's not going to go for it, right? But at the same time, if the customer has to you know can get authenticated with just one or maybe 2 steps, he may very well go for it, given that it makes his transaction experience smooth and secure at the same time. That being said, let's take UAE for example. UAE is not a market where ACS is being made mandatory, but the issuing bank has a lot to lose, not just in terms of the monetary value, but in terms of reputation as well.
Right.
One misstep, the bank's name gets dragged left, right, and center in the social media, and that is not something a bank would want. So that being the case, most banks, if not all, have seen a lot of merit to subscribing to a service like ACS, and at the same time also adding something called risk-based authentication in order to make the overall transaction experience much better to their end customers. Though uh, you know, there are improvements made on a daily basis, that has, at the end of the day, has only helped the end customer and the bank
Okay.
rather than add more hoops to it.
Sure. Sure.
I'd just like to add a point here, Chinar. I mean, if you
Sure.
think about a market such as Europe, right? Europe was strictly, I would say the adoption of 3DS in the older avatar of 3DS. The 3DS one was strictly limited, right? Many markets in Europe did not really use 3DS. And what happened is, as a result of certain security changes, such as the introduction of chip cards and some of these that came in, the fraud started shifting from card present transactions to the card not present world, right? Card present frauds came down, right? And that is POS transactions. It all shifted to e-commerce, right? And what has happened is, over the years, the regulatory bodies in Europe have also, the European Banking Authority has recognized something like this, and they brought something called PSD2, right?
Right. Right.
Services Directive, which advocates what is called strong consumer authentication, SCA. Right now, if what happens here is they are trying to figure out the best possible balance here. Again, there are certain exemptions. You can whitelist certain merchants for low value transactions,
Correct.
or merchants that have a very low fraud rate. You don't really use a second factor of authentication in all those cases. But if you do have to use a second factor, what they say is you got to combine two independent factors. One is called knowledge factor. One is called a possession factor, which is like a device or an OTP. Knowledge could be a PIN or a password. And the
Okay.
third one is what is called the inference, where I spoke about biometrics and behavioral biometrics.
Oh. Okay.
So they
Okay.
say you have to combine these two independent factors out of these three to complete your SCA. Right now, they've started introducing this. Of course, there's been resistance. Of course, there's been delays. and issuers don't know how many to challenge, how many not to challenge, and so on. They're going through that learning phase, which I imagine would be the case for other markets as well. Nobody is going to switch suddenly, and it will take a lot of time. But if they start seeing the merits in figuring a risk-based approach to it, as they get closer to that point where the customer convenience and security is balanced, markets will start adopting it.
And
Sure.
I think it's a delicate balance between the customer experience and transaction security.
Yep.
Though transaction security does take precedence here, um, unless there is a good user experience added to it or offered, I don't see, why an issuing bank would go for a service which is clunky. Rather, it is extremely important that the ACS service provider involved here offers a system that is extremely smooth and can have access to, or rather give access to customers to authenticate using multiple form factors, if at all required.
Sure.
And Madhu did mention briefly about the risk-based authentication, wherein the system would enable something called a frictionless authentication, wherein a familiar merchant, a whitelisted merchant, a whitelisted transaction pattern. Say, for example, if I'm using, I book a cab to work every day, I shouldn't have to go through the process of entering an OTP every time I have to book a cab, right? And if I'm ordering meal on, say, Curry or Zomato on a daily basis, needless, it's going to be a bit redundant for me to enter OTP at every stage. So it makes all the more, it adds value to the overall experience when the AC system that you subscribe to or a bank subscribes to is intelligent enough to understand that a customer is has a certain pattern of operation and how best to uh, add overall value to his experience. So, like I said, a delicate balance between experience and security.
Definitely. So, Anish and Madhu, you both mentioned about risk-based authentication in your previous answers. So, I would like to understand what actually is risk-based authentication and how does it aim to improve the authentication experience on the whole?
Yeah. So the earlier, way of authenticating a customer, the initial days of the, ACS systems of the protocol was typically as soon as a customer goes on a merchant that is ready to invoke a 3DS experience for a customer, automatically a customer would receive a page where he had to enter either the password or the OTP, right? That would come up for every transaction that you do, irrespective of whether, the transaction was a low amount one, like Anish said, or if it's a regular merchant that you've done, it's the same device, it's the same time of the day, and so on, right?
Right.
It didn't matter. Every transaction you do would typically go through a challenge process, right? So that actually led to a scenario where a lot of customers stopped going on such merchants. For example, if I went on Zomato and I tried this and Zomato sent me to an OTP page, I would say, okay, I don't want Zomato. I would rather go to another page which doesn't give me this, right?
Right.
There could be that sort of a scenario. And automatically you lose customers, you have cart abandonments, people just close it and go, and that's typically loss for you, right? So that's really how it all started. And what they figured is that, as we got more towards the mobile era and a lot of customers coming in, a lot more data started getting gathered on the merchant end, they figured that it was time for the new protocol, which is 3DS2, where they're getting a lot more data about customers, right? And they're able to share this data with the issuers. And now they're telling the banks, hey, here's a lot of data for you. Why don't you use all this data, build a customer profile or a history of a customer's transactions, and then based on that, you please evaluate each transaction whether there is some element of risk associated. And if there is no risk associated or very, very little risk associated with the transaction, why don't you go ahead and give a customer a chance to do it without any additional factor of authentication?
Right.
And case in point could be like low value, same device, regular merchant, right? And then I decide, hey, okay, I know all this is fine, you can let this go, right? On the other hand, it's a new merchant, it's a new device, slightly higher amount, right? And I would decide that, hey, I think this is slightly different from his usual behavior, so why don't I go ahead and introduce a challenge just to validate, right? So that's an example of a scenario where you've assessed the risk and decided that a challenge is required, right? Now, a third scenario could be, hey, I'm transacting on some North Korean or some merchant from somewhere, or something which is totally off, right? Something is very, very different. The behavior is totally surprising to me, and the amount seems to be very, very high, or something of that sort. Then you decide that, hey, this really does not fit the context here at all. I don't want to take such a chance and let something like this through. You could go ahead and decline such a transaction right there.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So,
Okay.
in a nutshell, that really is what risk-based authentication is. You evaluate each transaction for risk, build on what is called the customer profile. It's a customer's transaction behavior, the current transaction data that you get,
Okay.
device profiling that you can do merchant level profiling, and so on, right? You can use all this plus any other additional data that you might get from other systems, and then make a decision what you need to do with the transaction. So, I mean, from experience and from case studies, mostly about 90% of transactions tend to be low risk, right?
Okay. Okay.
You really don't need to challenge 90%. Maybe about 8% of transactions at most need to be challenged, and about 1 or 2% would probably fit in the category of declining. So that really is where the industry is looking to get to. That might take a while, but yeah, that really is the approach.
Definitely. Anish, what's your take on it?
So Madhu went at it at a very, a
Yeah.
holistic approach. He's pretty much covered all that I had to say about it. I would like to just add a couple of points here. In a market where frauds are higher, it is extremely important that we have an RBA system or a risk-based authentication system that is extremely good at capturing all these potential fraudulent transactions. For example, he mentioned a market like India, where a transaction, about 90% of transactions are relatively risky. It's not just in India, in most markets for that matter. Even growing markets, emerging markets like the Middle East, uh, we have relatively low risk transactions amounting to a total of about 90%. Let's say the remaining 10% is where the risk is. What we need to do is to make sure that we capture or rather we flag these 10% of transactions by either stepping it up and adding additional challenges here by asking the customer for say his or her Emirates ID, or that could be one form factor, or any other ID for that matter. And then there are transactions where there's going to be multiple red flags flying. For example, different country, different device, very high value of transaction, or multiple transactions happening in a very short space. So all these are flags that are identified and typically known to follow a pattern of potential fraud, a suspect fraud. So that's where a system needs to be capable enough and should have enough intelligence to flag or decline a transaction. And this is not something that happens with just one or two attempts. Any risk-based authentication system is a very good system of RV system is built over multiple iterations. What that means is the three of us here, Chinar, Anish, and Madhu, each of us have different profile when it comes to how we do our transaction. Maybe you like traveling, taking a cab to travel quite frequently. I enjoy watching movies by going to a theater. Not so much in the last 2 years, but I do. Madhu might enjoy ordering food online. So we have three different profiles. And when we try and operate out of a regular, usually observed pattern,
Right.
if our issuing bank is the same, the system, the RV system should be capable enough to identify that there is something out of the usual and to try and challenge us to see if it is actually us who's doing this. So any good risk-based authentication system should work on the principle of trying to eliminating a potential fraud transaction. It is okay if there is an additional step involved there, but at the
Right.
end of the day, it is going to make the customer happy as long as the objective is taken care of.
Definitely. Definitely. So we have some questions here. We'll take those questions before moving ahead. So Mr. Madhu Srinivas has asked, frauds in BNPL segment, mainly on e-commerce purchases, are on the rise. Are we equipped to identify customer profiles at the time of transaction?
Yeah, that's in fact, I was reading about BNPL frauds a little earlier today. And BNPL obviously represents one of the fastest growing segments in terms of payment options. And most of the millennials and the younger customers, I'd say somewhere between 25 to 40 typically, right, are all sort of gravitating towards BNPL as an option and moving away from cards, right? Some of them may not really have a credit history, so to speak. Some of them may not really want credit cards and build up a loan or a liability. They want to sort of go in and look at this option. Obviously, there's convenience, paying 3 or 4 installments, and then there's the obvious advantage for merchants as well. There's no drop off. It's a very easy one to go, and they get the full payment up front, and at the end of the day, the issuer is left to fend if there's a problem at the end of the day, right? So I think,
and more than that, it's just one-click experience, right? The overall BNPL.
yeah, the experience, the overall ecosystem seems to benefit from the experience. There's no doubt about the fact that the experience is quite seamless at the end of the day, right? But the risk associated is something that we have probably not yet started factoring, or it's gone so fast that the ones who started supporting it have stopped to sit and actually start thinking about this. But if you think about the way you can actually identify some of these, right, it's a slightly different proposition. You may not have so much of a history of these customers because these customers do not have much of a transaction history on maybe cards, for example, right? And they've come in very, very recently into the online space. They may just have a completely different profile, right, which you don't have access to. That is really where the external databases and your access to those comes in, right? For example, I'm on, say, an Amazon, and I've typed in my name and email ID or whatever, and phone number, and I'm coming in to go ahead with a BNPL option, right? These are all typically data points that are there at a merchant end, right? And what happens is, can you use information built on these? Can I use the name, the email ID, the IP, the phone number, and work with data sources and repositories that can actually build a profile? Can I use social data, social network data? Can I identify if this guy has got a valid LinkedIn profile? Can I identify if this guy is this email ID a fake one, or is this an email ID which is genuinely there? Have we done transactions on this? How about the mobile phone? Is it registered in the user's name, or is it like a fake SIM? Can I check what the SIM's activation date is? Is it like some old one? Has there been some recent change? Has there been some SIM swapping done, for example, right? And what about an IP and location? Is this a profiling or IP profile which is matching the customer's regular location? I mean, or is his address saying America and the guy is transacting from somewhere else, for example, right? There's a lot of such checks that can happen, right? Now, it all depends on how much data you can access and how much data you receive from the merchant, right? I believe we've not even scratched the surface of BNPL fraud, because I think we've all been so swept away by the experience and everybody is signing on to these. I think it's a matter of time before fraudsters start gaming these, and they're usually like 5 or 10 steps ahead. And in this case, it presents them with an even better opportunity, right? You just go ahead and buy it and run away, right? That doesn't even matter. Nobody even knows your identity, right? So I think that's really when it starts hitting issuers. They might realize. But I think these are some of the different ways that you could look to build a risk intelligence. I mean, not the standard ways, because you don't have a history of these customers just yet, right? So, but I think these are the ways that you could use, and social profiling and IP, email, and so on will help actually. Hope that answers your question, Ash.
Great. So we'll move on to the next question by Miss Isabella Morris. So she's asking, how can M2P support MFA in Africa, where in places internet is patchy as well as with high number of feature phones?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly like I said, when you design the authentication experience, right, you have to take into account different markets and what is available in these markets, what is not available in these markets, what sort of challenges exist when you set up these authentication options, right? So SMS may still work in some of those African markets, may not, right? I I may not know the details, but in markets where the SMS or the network setup is still okay, some of the African countries, SMS could still work. It obviously works across feature phone or smartphones, right? But on the other hand, if some of the advanced markets could use biometrics and some of these other ones, but where there's an internet challenge, for example, right, some of these approaches may not work, right? So you could still use IVR, for example. Those are like good old methods. You could have an IVR call triggered to a customer, get his validation, for example, right? You could use advanced network level verifications of the device, right? There are verification possible where the device is, connecting directly to the network, and you validate the identity of the device, right? Like I mentioned, is this device a recent device? Has this device been used earlier, and so on? And is there an aging consideration? There's approaches like that. The passive ways of authenticating, right? Then there's the obvious soft token or an offline OTP thing, which does not really rely on the internet. For example, you have something embedded inside your app. The OTP keeps generating, it's a time-based OTP. Every 30 seconds, you have an OTP generating out there, right? So that's something that could, mitigate some of the risks associated with network or patchy coverage of internet, for example, right? So some of these, of course, a knowledge-based authentication, the good old methods of passwords, and some of those are still there. But I think there are still more advanced ones, like I mentioned, which could be used, and you could still achieve these. So it's important to be very flexible in how you design these, present these options to issuers, and based on the market understanding, they're going to choose the best possible ones.
To add to what Madhu just said, Isabel, I think there are markets, like you said, where internet is patchy and there is a lot of feature phones. Smartphones are prevalent in only a handful of these emerging African countries. There are technical advancements wherein a lot of these feature phones also do out-of-band authentication through USSD. That is something that has been on the rise as well, and that is something that can be explored to authenticate a customer's transaction. Maybe that could be the big game changer here.
I think that makes a lot of sense, Anish, because if you think about how India is also planning to introduce UPI for non-smartphones, feature phones,
Correct.
I think they're going to build it based on USSD and
USSD.
So on. And a lot of banking transactions are already happening via USSD approach, right? So I think that's another option. Again, it remains to be seen how much of it and how this can be set up for authentication. But yes, we certainly have a few options out there in these markets that you can set up.
It's almost anticlimactic that the more technically advanced we go, the more we'll have to look at a technology that is at least 25 years old, and in trying to help us in places where the internet is unreliable and where we may have to reach out to the mass market.
I mean, add to it the fact that you should have a risk-based approach, which means you have to challenge very few and not all of them, right? So that's really the way.
Yes.
I hope this answers your question, Isabella. Okay. Now, moving on to the last question of the session. How much of a role does a bank have to play in setting up an ACS platform for their customers?
Yeah, I mean, except for the fact that the ACS system is typically hosted by the ACS provider. Like, I have the system set up on my data center or cloud, right? But everything to do with the experience of the authentication is actually decided by the bank, right? The bank will be the one that decides how the UI, the UX is going to look, how the pages are going to appear. What are the configurations behind the scenes? Should I introduce OTP as the option? Should I introduce something else as the option? Should I roll this out for all my customers or only some of my customers? Should I give a risk-based authentication approach at all, right? And if yes, should I again have some sort of filters out there? Many such configurations, right? Every configuration of the ACS is decided based on the business and risk choices of the bank, right? It's just purely the hosting at the end of the day that I do the ACS system. But again, coordinating with the networks, letting the networks know which bins are being enrolled in the ACS. Are they doing it for the entire base? Are they doing debit cards first, credit cards, so on, whatever it is, right? The entire system design is technically built based on inputs given by the issuer. Ultimately, because it is an issuer solution. It's just that it is actually hosted or outsourced to an ACS provider because it involves certifications. You obviously have to go through the whole certification process. The issuer has to complete the UAT before going live. They have to test it out. There's whole internal CUG testing. They have to assist in a lot of those as well. So issuers play a fairly significant role in terms of designing the system and ensuring that it has a smooth go live. But ultimately, the hosting is more often than not completely taken care of here. There's also the whole security key exchange and many other things that come in. But yeah, it's a very significant part that the issuers play.
Sure. Anish?
Uh, Madhu has given a very detailed account of what issuers do when it comes to, he's the product expert, he knows best. When it comes to the business side of things, however, bank has to, decide on how they want the entire business flow to be uh, offered to their end customers, how they want the transactions to be authenticated. There are key areas where they need to get involved as to what their authentication flow needs to be. What are the factors they want to authenticate the customers for, and how exactly the overall experience plays out. That being said, the ACS as a product is something that is highly configurable, and it's something that can come in multiple flavors based on how the issuer bank prefers it. And with all the latest advancements in the new CDS 2.2, merchants, the issuing banks, and the customers, the end customers stand to gain a lot from the overall experience and the security features involved. And I think with that, what I would want to leave you with is the overall role played by a bank when it comes to the entire setup and go live of a end-to-end AC system is about 15 to 20%. Uh, as you know, in terms of decision making, they play more of a program manager role, and they decide the terms on how they want the system to be. But the system on the whole is conceived, built, and offered to the bank based on how the bank's input is. Although any points you would like to add to that?
Fair enough, right? I mean, it really comes down to understanding what the ecosystem is like
Exactly.
in the market. How are the customers? What's the customer base like? What are their typical preferences? Like like one of the questions asked about what Isabel asked. Is OTP the best choice at all, or do we have to go with something else? Do they expect most of the transactions to be challenged or not? What type of challenge? What type of risk rules? What type of business decisions? A lot of these are considered. And again, so there is a very, very crucial role that they play. But of course, it's also critical, like Anish mentioned, that the ACS be designed as a configurable system, because you can't present them a standard system and expect everyone to take this. I cannot take the same system right here and say, hey, in the UAE, you just take the same system that I have out here. No, there could be certain parameters that are required. There could be certain changes that are required, but that's really the the way the system has to be designed. It has to be able to adapt.
Right, definitely. Sure. So, thank you, Anish. Thank you, Madhu. I think this would be all from my side. The stage is open for questions. So, if anyone wants to ask a question, they can raise their hands, and we can give them access to ask their questions themselves personally from the experts. I believe we took a lot of questions in between the sessions. So, let's see. No questions. Okay, last question. There is one by Saurabh Sharma.
How does a bot influence payments?
Yeah, I think again, it remains to be seen. Specific challenges such as bots. Uh, Sometimes these tend to be more present in the case of banking scenarios. People getting access to their logins, people getting access to their portals, and bots taking over account takeovers, for example. Right? These are scenarios which bots have been generally out there, right? I mean, in specific payment scenarios also, it could just happen that, for example, you could click a phishing link. So phishing fraud, typically you could click on a particular link and you could get redirected to a page where the page could, and because you clicked on such a link, that particular system has gotten control of your mobile phone or gotten control of your application, and then automatically data from your system is fed into that, and so on and so forth, right? There's controls such as those. And yeah, like I said, if imagine a bot has gained control of your system because you've clicked on a suspicious link unknowingly, bots could typically just gather information from your system, which is maybe an OTP, for example, right? Imagine that the card credentials are there. You're on a merchant page. You're about to transact. The bot has got control of your SMS messages. It's got your OTP and automatically feeds in the OTP, for example, right? You could be victims on these sort of scenarios as well. I believe that these are obviously going to be better addressed if you build use such applications such as behavioral with risk analysis, because it's very, very difficult for a customer to actually say he didn't do it because if the OTP has actually gotten entered on such a scenario. So that's really where the behavior overall profiling comes in and the analysis comes in, right? So in a transaction scenario, bots, I think these could be scenarios. Again, I haven't heard of many such scenarios, but there could be fake sort of man in the middle attacks. They could set up applications to mirror your ACS page. They could tamper with the overall security in that and then use you to go onto such pages and grab information from your systems as well. So yeah, I think those are scenarios. Account takeover, I believe, still represents the biggest threat that bots have brought. So again, on the merchant front, it's very strong possibilities. If they capture your control there, they could go in and they could have specific transactions that get initiated and so on. Again, there are many scenarios where customers end up saving their credentials on that, save their cards. They don't really want to enter it again. And imagine scenarios where it's a risk-based approach, and in markets where there's no second factor authentication, right? So you would just, again, that's really the reason why I believe the success of 3DS2 and authentication in going forward, is if there's a strong cooperation between merchants, issuers, and payment system providers and advanced risk system providers such as risk engines, behavioral systems, device binding, and so on, right? There's a lot of these that have to come together and use the data to fight these things. Yeah.
Thanks, Madhu. Thank you, Saurabh, for the question.
I hope that answers your question, Saurabh. Thank you very much.
Great. So I would just conclude the session. Thank you so much for attending the session today. We hope we were able to highlight how secure transactions can be with this innovative and essential product, that is ACS. Well, this isn't the end. Please reach out to us at businessmena@m2p.me if you have any questions. I'll just repeat and type it in the chat also, the email ID, so that you can reach out to us if you have any questions. And we will be back with another Power Packed session in March. So stay tuned to our LinkedIn page for all the latest updates. Thank you for attending once again. Stay safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Madhu. Thanks,
Bye.
Anish.
Thanks so much, Chinar. Thanks all of you for attending. Bye.